So, Paul, we can talk about almost anything you want, but I think I have some good questions for you.
Well, I'm blushing from your introduction, and my Irish self tends to blush a lot, so thank you. Let me say that first. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Hervé and Kevin and Peter and Doug for their beautiful music. It's really wonderful. I'd like very much to ask them if I could start my every lecture at Harvard Medical School with them. I think that would boost attendance. And
the richness of Haitian culture is always astounding. And I'm wondering why you think American young people so respond to you and your story. And don't be modest. I know you tend to go that way. Tell us what you really think.
Well, you know, I was lucky enough to go to Haiti the year after college before I started medical school. And in that time, which was more than 30 years ago, I've seen not so much young people interested in my story, but interested in connecting to issues that are well beyond their own personal experience. And this just seems to happen more and more. In 1984, when I went to Harvard Medical School to start my medical studies, every year there's about 150, 160 students in the class. This small class, there are probably over 10,000 faculty at Harvard, clinical faculty. It's a huge place. And we would have meetings back in the 80s. We would call them International Health Interest Group. We would never call it that now. And 2 or 3 students might show up. And if we threw in, as we always did, the question of poverty that you brought up, you said that I turned to that rather recently. Clearly you didn't read my best-selling book, Women, Poverty, and AIDS. The subtitle of which I thought was pretty cool, Sex, Drugs, and Structural Violence. It missed your eye. In any case...
well, what I meant was that you were a doctor before you were a writer.
Well, that just means that my early writing wasn't very good, I fear. Because technically, that's not true. In any case, nowadays, in these classes, again, we look at poverty. It's not just international health is the old school way of looking at it. It's global health equity. Of course, there are problems, as you said earlier, problems right here in this country, the ones that Michael Harrington described, are anything but eradicated. So I'd say now I just see so many students, not just in medical school, which I teach medical school, and physicians, see young people everywhere. And it's a really a welcome trend. And so I don't take any credit for being anything other than a cheerleader for it and a participant in it.
Well, in this book, as well as in some of your previous books, you say things that other people would be pilloried for saying. I mean, they would be called a dirty communist, socialist, liberal, pinko, redistribution weirdo.
You don't think I've been called that before?
Well,
I think at least in 10 countries I've been called that.
Well, I'm just wondering how you get away with it, and in fact are admired for it instead of marginalized.
Well, you know, I think part of it is, if that is true, and I hope it's true, I don't think it's acceptable to marginalize people who say, hey, this is a big problem. Poverty and inequality are big problems in the world. You know, if you have over 1 billion people still living on less than $1.25 a day, you know, you can't even get a cup of coffee, I've noted, in your neighborhood here for $1.25. You should be laughing. Someone just said $5 for a cup of coffee. That's a problem. When it costs, most people could not afford a cup of coffee, much less, you know, to have a decent living, safe housing, clean water. So to say that these things are important should not result in marginalization. But back to an answer, that I've thought about it as well too. I mean, received a pretty warm welcome in lots of different places, you know, across the world. Part of it has to do with being a physician, I would guess, or a nurse, or I'm a physician, but I would hope that another direct service provider, a nurse or a social worker, would have the authority of service behind his or her statements about the problems that are described in not only in those boring books that nobody reads, but in the speeches where people they're shocked that I've actually said the things I said, and then, people clapped, because they really are about, violence against the poor, about epidemic disease, about a lot of stuff that you wouldn't normally consider as normal graduation day fare for grandma. But, grandma's interested too, and the young people are interested in what can we do to take on some of these problems.
There was some talk a while ago, maybe during the first Obama administration, that you might be the person to head USAID. What happened to that?
Thanks, Lois, for bringing that up. I think I just don't think that not everybody has the talents to transform a bureaucracy, especially one with. And transformation, why transform a bureaucracy? I mean, all bureaucracies are transformed regularly, or they're changed regularly because they're created not by God, but by humans. And there's a lot of problems in the aid machinery of the world, in our aid machinery, and in, in all of it. And nobody really denies that inside those institutions. But changing, and I'll just give an example. When you look back at some of the unfair trade practices that happen, for example, the flooding of Haitian markets with cheap, subsidized rice, for example, from the United States, we know that we can study, and we should study, how that happens and how it comes to actually hurt poor people in places like Haiti and many other places in the world. We can and should study it. Changing it requires major changes in foreign policy, in trade subsidies that have been long in place, in the iron triangle between some of the grain producers, the shippers, and some of the aid machinery on the ground. There are serious problems with delivery of services. And when you look at that and say, who is going to be best at trying to change these institutions, and who is going to be best, or what people are going to be best at actual delivery of services. And again, my services I'm interested in are largely healthcare services, but the same goes for agriculture, microfinance, education, and learning from that. I just think I think I realized that I was better suited for that part of the equation. I will also add that I like teaching and seeing patients and being able to speak my mind.
Yeah,
Is that what you wanted me to say?
I don't think you should say what I want you to say. I think you should say what you feel.
Well, let me put it this way.
Will.
When I was contemplating it, and I probably shouldn't say this in front of such a large crowd, but I'm going to anyway. They said, some of the people in Washington said, well, what we're going to need a copy of all of your writings that might be considered controversial. And I showed up and had these two giant, I call them WL bags, white liberal bags, the kind you use here in New York. Hemp. I was carrying them, and I won't mention anybody by name, but a recently former Secretary of State said, Paul, what are you doing with those shopping bags? I said, well, they said to bring a copy of all my potentially controversial writings. So there were lots of stuff in there. And I could tell you other somewhat funny stories, but it's just, in the end, I think finding out what you're suited to do and sticking to that. It's one of the messages I give in that book a lot to young people and people say, should I do what you do? And anybody who says, yes, you should do what I do, is not a good teacher. You're a teacher, you know that that's true. People have to capture their own passion if they want to last long in social justice work. That's true in medicine, that's true in poverty reduction. It's a long slog.
So one of your colleagues, one of the founders of Partners in Health, Dr. Kim, is now the head of the World Bank. Is he going to be able to be himself in that structure, or will the structure change him? And does it worry you?
Structures always change people, right? I mean, That is, your environment sculpts who you are. You don't need a degree in anthropology or sociology to understand that. But there's nothing that leads me to believe that Jim Kim is not going to spend the rest of his life, as he has all of his adult life, fighting poverty and trying to find new ways to do it. I mean, to end extreme poverty requires, again, that we do have the courage to change the institutions that were developed over the last century to take on poverty. And I hope anybody who reads the book or any other book does not hear me saying, there's no hope for these institutions. They're too entrenched. They're not changeable. That's just not true. Because as I said, they're not God-given, immutable, force majeure, whatever you want to call it. They're all actually of recent vintage. That this is only 67 years. I was recently with Jim Kim at a small community-based college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we both were trained.
Yeah.
And he told us...
An insolvent one.
I hope not. Please,
no.
I need my job if I'm going to be running my mouth so openly. And I think it was there that he told the story of being, not too long ago, we were all there at a protest called 50 Years Isn't Enough, which was a critique of the World Bank and the International Financial, the IMF, the IFIs as we call them, the International Financial Institutions. Jim still believes, and I know he always will believe, that we can and must improve the function of our institutions, those ones and others that could make a dent in extreme poverty and change it. Some of us like working more directly with communities affected by poverty. They're living in poverty still, with patients, with student groups, with women's cooperatives. You got to find out, again, not only what you'd like to do, but where you'd like to try and make a difference.
When Occupation Wall Street happened last year, a lot of the star professors at Columbia, like Jeff Sachs, like Joe Stiglitz, they went down and they marched. Did you feel tempted?
I was not in this country very much, but the impact of poor economic policies and strategies from this country affect everyone. And so, yes, I was tempted to participate and to learn in what we could all learn. Again, these are institutions created by us. The idea that only 1% of this country creates them is not true. We all have a stake in these institutions, and just by sheer force of our own responsibility and engagement, sure, I want to be part of anything that can improve, again, or lessen any harm that could be done. That's supposed to be my profession's watchword, is do no harm.
So in this new book, you talk about life being a lottery, and that it's just a chance that we're born rich or poor, or even it's just by chance that we're born in situations where we can live adequately. Does the thought of that scare you?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it's very frightening to think that there's a kind of fecklessness of fate. And, I didn't understand that until I was 22, 23. Because, I realized that although I grew up in pretty modest circumstances, it wasn't until I went to Haiti that I realized I'd been sheltered from want, from hunger, from, I won't say getting wet, when it rained. That's another story. My niece is here, she'll know the story. But sheltered from danger and privation, and in a way that a lot of the people I met in Haiti were not. And
yet...
that's scary to me. It's frightening. And to go into a jail in Siberia where everybody's coughing because they have MDR-TB, or a jail in Rwanda where the same sort of thing is happening medically, and you just think, what would I have done if I had, I think also horrible thoughts, like what would I have done if I were a 20-year-old man in Rwanda in 1994? Those are frightening thoughts to me. And you'd like to think you'd have done the right thing and resisted not just the impact of structural violence, but the impact of real violence. But you don't know that.
You say,
I don't know if I answered your question.
It's okay. It's
It scares me.
interesting. But you grew up, as you say, in modest circumstances. You grew up kind of poor. Is that part of what opens your heart to the poor?
Well, I could say, well, I grew up in a family of 8, and I became a doctor working on poverty issues, and my youngest brother became a pro wrestler on television. We had the same experience. But actually, all of my, my sister, who's the mother of the young woman here tonight, is an artist, an art teacher, went to art school. But we are all very alive, I think, to the misfortunes of other people and understand, because I now would completely reject the notion that I grew up poor, having seen what extreme poverty looks like. Not true at all. But the proximity to it, to people who were not always reliably employed and couldn't count on, the proximity was, something that I think we cherish our knowledge of that. My brothers and sisters, and they're very supportive of this work that's described here, all of them, no matter what it is they do.
I know this is going to embarrass you because you don't
well,
like...
hey, you haven't avoided embarrassing me so far.
I do my best, but I know you don't like to think of yourself this way, but you're a kind of humanitarian celebrity, if there is such a thing. How do you reconcile that with your beliefs and your goals, or do you use it?
Well, I mean, first of all, you say humanitarian celebrity, but I almost never get that in a clinic, or I'm a celebrity, but it has nothing to do with, it's just you're a doctor, you're trained, you're well known, and so a lot of the people I work with, the doctors and nurses, receive a similarly reverential treatment in the clinics and hospitals and prisons where we're serving people who might not otherwise have had care. And I don't think anybody would call that humanitarian celebrity.
But I'm talking about outside.
I know what you're talking about, and I'm just saying, if I can use, I'm kind of humbled, more than kind of humbled, I'm quite humbled that there would be, looks to me like 1,000 people here to hear about mayhem, epidemic disease, genocide, poverty, and all the other cheerful subjects that I write about. But if there is a way to connect this to that is, connect this to the people who are experiencing directly the privation that I'm describing, then I'll do it. I'm not saying I like it. I'm just saying that I think it's important not to pretend that we live in 3 worlds, first, second, and third, but to acknowledge we live in one world, and to fight to make those connections. And again, as you said, the R word, redistribution, to move some of those resources from places where there are enough or even too much to places where there is so little. I'm willing to risk the scorn of someone who might say humanitarian celebrity is in a dismissive way.
Well, the people who are drawn to you very often because of your humanitarian celebrity. Does it help?
Sure, and it helps in the way of that I just mentioned. It helps move important things, that is staff and stuff, to people living in poverty and facing enormous burdens of disease. I've already seen a bunch of people here. I came early. I've seen, support friends of yours, but also supporters of Partners in Health. Almost all the ones I saw, young physicians who are working in places like Togo, for the last 10 years, who are doing something very similar to Partners in Health, a younger generation. I've met teachers, and there are people who are here in this room who can help us move staff and stuff. I'm not going to embarrass anybody by name, but there are people in this room who, I took them to Haiti, and we were visiting a hospital, the new one that we've just opened in Mirbalais, and I was whining, I thought rather expertly, about the fact that you can't have a modern hospital without a CAT scan. And within an hour after leaving in the car, I had a CAT scan. Now, I think that we should be doing things. I have deep gratitude. There's a CAT scan in rural Haiti. It is the first CAT scanner in a public hospital in Haiti anywhere. It's a country of 10 million people. It is the first CAT scanner in a hospital in rural Haiti. And, you know, I saw that when Jennifer was speaking, she mentioned Eve Ensler, who's coming here. I ran into her about a month ago, and not in the cinema, but more in this health and humanitarian cinema. No, it's not called cinema when it's a play, right?
No, theater?
Theater. Don't tell her I said that. I'm kidding. But what did we talk about? We were talking about gender-based violence, you know, as the latest buzzword goes in the Congo, and I had seen a fair number of patients, not so much in Rwanda, but from across the border in Congo, as I have elsewhere. And I was saying the same thing: is every hospital that has that aspires to provide good medical care needs a CAT scanner. So that's again back to the question of exploiting any kind of I hate to call it humanitarian celebrity, but you know, I said, not saying that I'm saying for those small number of people who are scornful of that, there's a huge number of people who actually want to learn more about how to address poverty and inequality and the health problems that ensue. And I'm very, heartened by that people who are not in this field would say, yeah, that's a really important and true thing to say, that we need these tools.
In one of your chapters in To Repair the World, you talk about Martin Luther King, who you read very carefully and you kind of understood. You see him as far more than an icon. And you say that he had to make a constant choice between his celebrity and what he knew to be morally right. Do you ever have to make those kind of choices?
I think, of course.
Like what?
Well, for example, when things that have occurred in Haiti that are clearly the result of malfeasance from abroad, sometimes from my country, I don't want to pretend that is not related to some of the political tumult that makes it very difficult to provide good medical services, especially public health, which requires safety and a lack of that kind of upheaval. Same in Rwanda. If we pretend we can't figure out how, again, I'm going to use a clumsy word that I may have pulled out of that book, but they're translocal, transregional forces. Like what happened in Rwanda was not all due to people and forces inside Rwanda, but in fact to forces stretching across time and place in other countries, including France, the French government, and Belgium, and it goes back in time. Those are usually, anytime you see structural violence, that is, I don't know if the term is useful, but you see how large-scale social forces, I'm sorry, I sound like a grad student in anthropology, which I was for many years. Large-scale social forces like structured racism, bad foreign policy, gender disparities, inequality, these are not things that we are trained to understand very well in medical school. But if you see them and can't understand that link between what you can see right in front of you, like a patient who's been the victim of some aggression, and the forces that are behind it, not just the person, that's an example, I think, that Martin Luther King discussed. Could we understand the war in Vietnam? He said, how is the war in Vietnam related to the struggle for racial equity in the United States? How is the struggle for racial equity in the United States related to the struggle against poverty? He really took on tough questions, and more in the last years of his life. And so I do elevate him, especially for his unwillingness to accept accolades and praise if he could stop talking about the war in Vietnam or the role of bad governance in the United States, on the continuation of unacceptable poverty.
Well, there's often talk about you getting the Nobel Peace Prize, as he did in
I hear it all the time in the
Yeah.
clinic in Haiti.
Yeah, sure. But you're a lot of people's candidate for that prize. In terms of Dr. King, it did bring great honor to his struggle, but it also brought him enemies that may have in the end been fatal enemies. Do you ever fear that for yourself?
Well, I work with a very, Martin Luther King obviously was the leader of a movement. And there were other leaders in the movement, but he had long been a leader in the movement. I am not trying to be a leader in a movement so much as a servant who is part of a larger movement. And, there are, across time and history, these big human rights struggles, the struggle against slavery, the struggle for civil rights in this country that we're talking about, the struggle against colonialism in India. These nonviolent struggles, or they were violent, as you said, but the idea that you could fight this kind of structural violence by doing things like building hospitals and clinics and talking about food security, it's a different kind of danger to oneself. Now, if you work in places like Guatemala at the end of a genocidal spree, or in Peru at the very tail end of a civil war, or in Haiti during the last 30 years, there have been many violent upheavals, as you all know. Sure, you're in closer proximity to violence than you would be if you stayed in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Manhattan.
Maybe not.
Or maybe not. And that, this question of sequestering yourself away, if that's not a bad word in the United States right now, sequestering yourself away from violence, it's in the end, I think the best way to do it is to take on structural violence, to address poverty, disparity, inequalities in this global sense. That's what young people are doing who are involved in global health equity. It's not the same as international health, like when I was a student.
Let's talk about Haiti. Where were you when you first heard about the earthquake?
I had just left Haiti. I was in Miami.
Your favorite place, in fact. According to Tracy Kidder,
Well,
you live in the airport.
I'm trying not to do that anymore in my middle age, before dotage ensues. But I just left Haiti. We'd been there on a family vacation, not really working, and was headed for Rwanda when I got a call. I couldn't believe it. I don't watch TV too much, I'm embarrassed to say, and didn't have a television, in fact, and got phone calls and spent, and I left early the next morning for New York, and then the day after that, through the connections of President Clinton, got back to Haiti.
What did you see as you arrived?
Even from up in the air, first of all, I'd never seen so many planes around Haiti, and, there were dozens of planes trying to land, and the airport had been damaged, and the landing strip, there's only one landing strip, and the airport had been, the control tower had also been disabled by the earthquake. That in and of itself told me that, and also cell towers, and, I was trying to think, how could cell phone services go out? I mean, it takes, we started to understand that it was really a big earthquake, but we didn't know, nobody knew for sure. And I had a lot of friends and coworkers and, in Haiti, and at the time of the year, 4:53 in the afternoon, who were in that city. Anyway, from up in the air, you could see that the lights of the city were out, and you could also see some fires, and we spent hours waiting for a landing slot. And I was with some surgeons, some of here who are here tonight, with some volunteers. Most of us were physicians, and it was this thing that, I don't really want to talk about it, but I will if you push me. But
Well, what I want to ask
the thing that struck me getting off the plane was the stench.
The stench.
Yeah.
You could smell it?
Yeah. Yeah, it started on the third day. Huh. So it was just, a lot of it doesn't bear repeating, and I already did that book.
Well, after all you had seen in Haiti before, all those years, could you have imagined anything this bad?
No. I didn't. I didn't imagine it. I mean, later on you'd hear seismology experts were saying, "We told you so." I didn't know. I didn't know Haiti was smack on the top of a fault line. I knew that the city in northern Haiti had been destroyed in the, I think, late 18th century, and that there had been, and I'd felt tremblers and small earthquakes before in Haiti, but I had no idea that anything like that was going to happen. There had, it was right after a lot of the hurricanes that had so devastated Haiti in the course of 1 month. It was on the tail end of a pretty rough year.
At Columbia, we have a geologist named John Mutter who studied the after effects of Hurricane Katrina. And what he's concluded is that natural disasters are always exacerbated by poverty. That the same incident that will happen in an area that's developed and where there are systems will not be as lethal and as terrible in such a place as the kinds of things that were experienced in New Orleans and in Peru and in the Philippines with those mudslides and in Haiti.
He's absolutely right. I mean, a much larger earthquake hit Chile within a month in an urban area, and there was loss of life, but nothing like in Haiti, because the construction quality in Port-au-Prince is nothing had been built to code, and that the majority of the deaths were caused by collapse of largely cement buildings that had not even close to built to code. In fact, some of the very poorest people who live still in what I think are reasonably called huts, their houses were kind of too small to fail. And it was the cement 2-3 story and up houses that pancaked. And again, this is why after the Boston Marathon, a lot of Americans remembered how important it is to have a safety net, to have emergency services, to have hospitals that can handle injuries. I mean, it's the nature of an incident like that one, a bombing, where then a lot of people are injured at once. That's what happens with an earthquake. A lot of people are injured at once. And without strong systems and good institutions to bring people out of the field to the places where they need care, there's going to be a lot more death. I mean, nobody who made it to one of our teaching hospitals in Boston died, and there's a reason for that. I work at one of those hospitals, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, as you mentioned. And my colleagues there who are surgeons, and the teams that work with surgeons, the nurses, anesthesiologists, the supply chain, all of it works. It worked very well, and we need that in places like Haiti. You need it in places like Rwanda, the places that you mentioned already. And I think, back to talking to young people about problems like that, like the earthquake, political violence in Rwanda, or the aftermath of a bombing in a place so well supplied and well equipped as Boston, well staffed. It's a chance. An earthquake, like a bombing in the United States, is a chance for everyone to see, wow, we really all need safety and protection and to be shielded from harm, or at least to have that initial harm attenuated, palliated, treated with the tools that we have available to us in modern medicine, for example.
I'm wondering, the When you talk about Boston, of course it's not comparable in numbers to what happened in Haiti or Rwanda, but one of the things that came out of it was the sense that people as first responders really make a difference. Did that happen in Haiti?
That definitely happened in Haiti. The difference, so there was, as far as I can tell, the same instinct that you saw in Boston at the finish line, whereas people not running away, but really running towards people who were injured to help them. That happened everywhere in Haiti, and of course it was the Haitians who ran to help the injured in Haiti. The biggest, knock yourself out, because I was very moved by it myself, is the Haitians who succored the Haitians, who helped them. The difference is, then what? There's no ambulance, and it's not just because the streets were obstructed with rubble, which they were. That's not why. There's no ambulance, and there's no Brigham or Mass General to take them to. So all the goodwill in the world of people who want to help one another is still can't add up to what we want without some of the institutions that we all need.
Let's talk a little about mountains beyond mountains, which you sometimes say, "Oh, I don't teach."
I didn't
that.
write it.
Yeah.
I mean, you clearly loved women, poverty, and AIDS, so we can talk about that.
It's a book about your relationship, in part about your relationship with Tracy Kidder, and I often teach it as a book about the relationship between a source and a writer. Everyone who's read it is fascinated by your relationship. And how did Tracy change because of this extended profile?
Well, I ought to let him say that for him, describe it for himself. But I will say this. I actually met Tracy Kidder, thank you, many years before that, in 1994, when he was covering the American military's presence in Haiti after the restoration of the constitutional democracy that year under President Clinton. And I was not, I was trying to follow up on, there had been a murder in central Haiti, and people in the area where I worked, and I was upset about it, as one is about murder. Thank you, my fan club over here gets my humor. And, there's American troops there, and I'm an American. There weren't that many other Americans in that part of Haiti. Same place, by the way, Claudia, where we just opened this hospital in Mirebalais. So I went to Mirebalais, and I went to where the American soldiers were, and I said, "Hey, guys, you had this person in custody, and you let him go. And, this is bad." And this guy who had already introduced himself as Tracy Kidder was taking notes. And because I had thought, maybe, is that the writer, Tracy Kidder? No, couldn't be. He has on military fatigues. Journalists don't do that. It was Tracy Kidder. So you guys with your source and all that stuff. Anyway, we became friends after that. So by the time that in 1999 and 2000, when we spent a lot of time together, we knew each other pretty well. And how did that transform him? Again, that's his own story to tell. But it's been my experience that anyone who gets involved directly in these very dramatic experiences, life and death experiences, and can learn about them, you can learn why it's just ridiculous for someone to die in childbirth, in the middle of central Haiti, or why it's ridiculous to pretend that people with AIDS in Africa can't be treated. It's ridiculous, and it's terrible. And to try and understand also these forces that put some people at risk of extreme danger and shield others from risk. So I know that it has transformed him just by following what he's written and done after that book. I mean, his next book was about Burundi.
Well, the book is entirely about the nature of commitment and what it takes, and he's in a constant dialogue with you, whether it's out front or not, about what it takes. And the next thing we know about Tracy is that he's still a wonderful, brilliant writer, but he's now helping to finance a clinic in Burundi. He took in a young medical student who went to who was a homeless person and who survived the civil wars, and he kind of took him in his family. He is no longer that objective journalist. He's in the story.
Yeah. Well, you know what?
And it's because of you.
I got to say, thank you, Claudia. It gives me a little bit chill bumps to hear you say it so publicly. I think he's a much more objective journalist now. There is a false sense of objectivity that just really, I mean, to me, it's absurd. It's like saying, okay, you've got to tell both sides of the story. That's the classic cliche. It's like, well, what if one side of the story is, humans and the other is Staph aureus? I'm not, as an infectious disease doctor, going to say, well, I really feel equally about the bacterium and the humans.
Well, you can't interview the
bacteria. I think it's goofy.
Yeah.
And I just think to say, well, I've got to be objective about millions of people dying of AIDS, I think that's ridiculous. And I think he is a better, more objective thinker and writer from his engagement, as you said, as part of the story. I think it's wonderful. And what he's done by bringing, with his ability to write, which again, I know that you thought Women, Poverty, and AIDS was really super.
It's on my greatest hits
and
list.
then I saw your great review in the New York Times of The Global Threat of Drug-Resistant Tuberculosis, another one of my bestsellers. But what I think he's done is get more objective by acknowledging that you're not, as an observer of human events, objective. That's an illusion borrowed from physics. And compounded by the fact that a lot of people who are journalists don't really want to write about power and how it works.
So let's go on to the questions of the audience.
How did I do? I mean, you're the journalist, Professor.
I'm not rating you. You're a pretty good interview. Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
Have I mentioned that I like Tracy Kidder a lot?
Have I mentioned that you have never done a bad interview? Not even mediocre.
Thank you.
The interview that we did in the New York Times it still remains wonderful, and I'm so grateful for it. One of our participants here wrote, since the earthquake, how do you feel about the rates of HIV/AIDS in Haiti? And have they been directly affected because of the lack of drug access and the loss of community health centers?
It's a great question. And I won't be too technical in responding, but I will say for the biggest providers of those services, and that would be Partners in Health, which works with its sister organizations, Ami La Santé, and GESCO, actually, which is deep roots in this city because of its connection to Cornell. Those two organizations claim, I think correctly, that we didn't have any stockouts of our medications, and that we actually managed to find all of our surviving patients. And that's, of course, a bigger challenge in urban Haiti for GESCO, for Dr. Pop, and this wonderful team there. And it was tougher there because they were right in the middle of the quake zone, whereas most of our patients were outside the quake zone. The rates of HIV, if they are to have changed, would change just as much because of migration, right, from high prevalence urban areas where the earthquake happened to low prevalence areas where a lot of people took shelter. But I don't know that that's happened. Bigger problem may be tuberculosis, which is airborne, as you all know, and you do because you loved
yes,
the
my
threat
favorite.
of drug-resistant tuberculosis so much. I think that there are other problems that may have been worsened, and of course the cholera outbreak is a result not of the earthquake, but rather of the profound water insecurity, the lack of potable water systems in Haiti that has been going on for many years, that is rooted in decades of inattention.
Another member of the audience asks, he or she says that in your earlier books, you had many passionate criticisms of the Clinton administration's policies, particularly in Haiti. And this audience member wonders, and it's a really good question, how did you reconcile those criticisms with this partnership that you developed? I mean, he became almost like a second brother to you, and you really worked together during the quake and after.
Well, first of all, I mean, if he were here, I'd still say this. I think he came over to my work, not me coming over to his work. He's the one who came and said, we're going to do community-based HIV care and drop the prices of the drugs, and I'm just trying to make you guys laugh. But his involvement after the end of his presidency in health and social justice work has been, very inspiring to me. And I've learned a lot from him about things like what can you do to drop drug prices? How do you bring in generic manufacturers? And how can you, just to give you the numbers, the average wholesale price for the 3-drug regimen, so-called AIDS cocktails that we saw, were between $10,000 and $15,000 a year. I was giving a talk last week informally, and the great scientist and Dr. Tony Fauci from NIH was there. I think you've interviewed him before, but I said the figure, he said 18,000. But now it's probably $80 per person per year in a lot of the places where I work, and they're, quality assured drugs. I've learned so much from President Clinton about how we could move this forward, and also, back to this question of humanitarian celebrity, tried to use his connections, and if we're going to call it celebrity, I don't know what the word is.
If anyone is a celebrity.
Well, try to use that to move forward a social justice agenda that would roll out services in places like rural Rwanda, rural Malawi, rural Lesotho, and Haiti. So, in any case, back to the question, the things that I wrote in the 90s and before and since, and including now, about Haiti and its history and its complex relation to the United States, I have had no cause to renounce. And I did say to, I won't mention her by name, but one of his children, that I said, what do you think your father thinks about my, what do you think if you read, my books like Uses of Haiti? And she said, he or she said, the child, well, unlike Claudia Dreifus, he actually has read those books. No, she didn't really say that.
No.
She said, oh, he's already read them all. And so
you did send them to me. It's true.
Did.
Yeah.
And I talked to him about that one time, and he said, oh, you can write whatever you want. You're actually out there trying to fight to deliver services. That's what he said to me, and he's said it many times since. We don't talk about that much anymore after all these years of working together on projects and programs. Also, some of the things that I wrote about, for example, the impact of really unfair trade policies advocated by my country and their impact on Haiti. He's the one who, went before a Senate committee not too long ago and said some of the things we did during our administration really damaged Haitian agriculture, really undermined it. And I put that in my last book saying, see, he said it, and it wasn't that far off what I wrote. I didn't know a lot about, how decisions were taken in places like Washington or Paris or London or, wherever these institutions sit, the WTO, et cetera. And I have learned a lot since then, but the basic hypothesis is that these pathologies of power are real. They should be studied. We should understand them so that we can fix them and make them better and less damaging. And I think that's something that President Clinton has taught me a lot about too.
One of the members of the audience wants to know how you feel the impact of international investment in the debt kind of subverts any chance of change in really poor countries.
Well, international investment and debt are different, right? Yeah. Even a doctor knows that. And so international investment can help drive down poverty, right? There are many instances, of course, where it doesn't. But the basic idea, again, that President Clinton has written about this, and we've spoken about it together, is regardless of what your ideological background may be, and I'm not even sure I want to have an ideological background. They haven't served our species too well in the past. But regardless of what it may be, nobody's going to argue with the fact that extreme poverty is what underlies a lot of the problems that I've described in my writing and speaking, and that I see in clinical practice, and that growing economies can alleviate poverty, right, by definition. One of the questions that I've struggled with, as many of you have, is how do you grow the economy with equity front and center, right? How can you make an economy, which again, I don't really regard as a thing, right? Economies are created by humans. You know, people talk about, well, the market shuddered today, or anxious markets did this or that. You can't treat markets with anxiolytics like, you know, Valium. They're not alive, right? They're human institutions. So all of those little shudderings and squeakings and anxious PTSD-like things markets do are really humans doing things inside markets. So, back to your question, I think that investment is a good thing, and making it humane to grow economies justly, so you don't have, 1,000 people die in a collapse of a factory, in Bangladesh. That is well within our reach as a species, and so I'm all for it. Let's just make it fair and just, and create jobs that are safe for people and can allow families to, reach their own aspirations, or people that reach their own aspirations.
To switch gears, the member of the audience wants to ask a question that's usually asked of women when they're being interviewed. This audience member asked, but they also moderate this with a smiley button that says, "Thanks, Paul Haiti." They asked, how are you able to balance your work with your family life? What has been sacrificed, if anything?
Well, first of all, I would not presume to be prescriptive for anyone here. The way in which one gets involved in social justice work is going to vary enormously. If my own mother, who by the time she was 28 had 6 kids, she was spending all of her time working or making sure her very large, I was the shrimp of the family, very large kids had enough to eat on a daily basis. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying to anyone here, this is how you should do the work. I'm really saying to students and others, try to get involved. If you're lucky, your family will embrace the work. That's another thing why I'm addressing young people, is I think it would be great if more and more children did not see themselves as sequestered, again, that word, from the kind of problems that my family actually has seen firsthand. Not because they are, by any stretch of the imagination, poor, but because they've been living and working in places like Rwanda and Haiti and elsewhere. You want them to understand, at least I do. I want them to be understand and be involved. And I, like any parent, will just hope that they'll be grateful for that and not punitive as time goes by. And that's all I can say about it, because I don't think there is no cost to doing work like this. Of course I don't. I think when you are close to poverty and to violence of any sort, I keep on talking about structural violence as well, there is something damaging about it. But when you're far from it and pretend that it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist for you, there's something damaging about it. So I kind of have to throw up my hands and say, well, I think it's better to acknowledge it and try to do something about it.
Here are some questions from students. There's one student who asks, as an undergraduate college student, I often feel overwhelmed when I try to think of ways to break into the sphere of global health.
Yeah.
What advice would you offer to students like me who are constantly feeling pressured to enter traditional, local, small-scale medicine?
Well, if local means close to where you're a student, that could be a
guess.
good thing. I mean, it probably was not a good thing for me in medical school to be always in Haiti. In fact, in the second year show, which is an annoying thing that they do at Harvard Medical School, one of the jokes in my own class was people would come in and make an announcement at the end. They'd say, "Has anybody seen Paul Foreigner?" Which I knew to be directed to me. Local activism near your home university is an important thing. Take Columbia. There's a lot of health disparities in this city, one of the richest cities on the face of the earth, if not, I don't know who's keeping count, but looks like the richest one to me, sitting here in this part of town. There's a lot of problems here. So if you're interested in global health equity is what we're calling it, New York's on the globe too. Boston's on the globe too. And so the L word, local, was in the question. And I think get involved in local engagement. It's a good thing. There are some people here, I think, from Catholic Worker. I struggled in that year between college and medical school. I struggled with this problem a lot. I mean, it was a problem for me, and I was struggling with it. And I remember going to Catholic Worker here in this city and thinking, do I want to work? This is after some months in Haiti where I'd seen a couple terrible things happen. Do I want to work as a doctor? I was on my way to medical school, and I said, do I want to work as a doctor in Haiti or among the poor of my own country? And that's a good struggle to go through. I came up with my own answer, which is I'm going to work in my own country and in other countries. Because, again, Boston's on the globe, and Haiti's on the globe, and the Navajo Nation's on the globe, et cetera. But everybody needs to go through that process of discernment.
Someone with a very elegant handwriting asked, did you ever think that what you wanted to do was impossible? If so, what did you do to tell yourself to make it possible? And then this person adds, to Paul Farmer with thanks.
No, thank you for asking it that way. And the short answer is, of course, and yes, no.
Yes.
Of course, I struggle with that, but I don't work alone. I mean, I've never worked alone on anything, and it's hard to imagine any endeavor that's related to attacking, health disparities or whatever we'd like to call them. How could one person ever get anything done? The answer is they can't. You always have to work as part of a team. So when one of us, and we work as a big team, I have a bunch of coworkers, supporters, board members here tonight. Some of us were just in Haiti 2 weeks ago for what was one of the most uplifting times of my life, opening that. Did I mention that we opened a new hospital?
Well,
and
tell
we
us
didn't
about
do
your
it.
new hospital.
I would love to go back to that.
Yes.
You insert that question. But to answer the one from the student with the good handwriting, of course I struggle. And you see a patient, with a child with leukemia in the middle of a squatter settlement in rural Rwanda. What do you think? You feel, this is impossible. Or you see someone who's had serious injury. I mean, two kids who pick up a landmine when they're herding cows, going into a prison where there's no doctor, there's 13,000 prisoners with high burdens of, say, tuberculosis, HIV, you name it, malaria, not one doctor and one nurse who looks shell-shocked. You just think all the time in this work, this is just not possible. But it is possible, and that working with a team is part two of the question. The way you resolve that is step back and talk with other people about how could it be possible. How could you send, a rover, a Range Rover, or whatever it's called, to Mars? If you think this is impossible, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and those engineers and visionary people who did that. They had to all believe that whatever they were doing was impossible. And that had never been done before. It cannot be argued that no one's treated acute leukemia in a child before, said a femoral fracture, or done a colonoscopy, or treated AIDS successfully with a 3-drug regimen. None of that stuff is true. Or that you couldn't deliver complex surgical care, in a setting of great poverty. All false. It is, however, true that no one's ever, at some point recently, no one ever had sent a man to the moon before. So I think when you're dealing with poor people and people living in poverty, you really have to fight even harder to resist that, that failure of imagination. That's why I would like to say something about the hospital. Did I mention the hospital?
You've mentioned the hospital, and you should be congratulated on that hospital.
Well, I had, thank you. Thank you. And I can say that, my role was modest. I mean, and it had a lot to do with not saying this is impossible. In other words, with me saying that's not true, that it's impossible. The people who did it, though, the people who built it, it was a remarkable thing. It was a response in many ways to the earthquake, right? We'd already planned to build another community hospital there. I think it would have been our 11th in Haiti. And this is Partners in Health, which is a partnership organization, as the name suggests. And after the earthquake, all of the teaching infrastructure for doctors and nurses in Port-au-Prince, most of it was destroyed. The nursing school, for example, almost none of the second-year class survived, nor their teachers, because they were in the building at 4:53 in the afternoon, and they all died. And that's an example, back to the previous question, where you say, the whole nursing school was destroyed and the whole second-year class died, and their teachers. How are you going to recover from that, as healthcare providers in a country that already had too few nurses? So after the earthquake, people got together and said, well, what if we reimagine this modest hospital in central Haiti and made it into a more ambitious project, even though there are more problems? Because there are more problems. And so it became the largest solar-powered hospital in the developing world today. And, it is beautiful. I mean, it is. And the other thing about it is there were all kinds of people who had never been involved in global health before, or in Haiti. People who said, well, I'm a union member for an electricians union in Boston. I love the names. International Brotherhood of the Electrical Workers. I love that stuff. IBEW, Local 103. I hope they're listening. The Painters Union, the Carpenters Union, I mean, they're tradespeople, craftspeople from New England especially, were connected to us through a guy named Jim Ansera, who had sold a fairly large construction company in Boston, a youngish guy, at least to my eye. He looks young now, 55. And he said, I want to help. And he spent the last 2 years down in Haiti, 3, working on this. One of my former students from Chicago, David Walton, devoted 3 years of his life, which he'd already worked in Haiti 12 years since he was 23, like I did. He was the project lead. All of the Haitians who built it, the mosaic artists, from the United States, who I met in the airport in Port-au-Prince, said, why don't you come work on the hospital? And she trained all of these local mosaic artists. They didn't know they were about to be mosaic artists, but they are today, and they have jobs. So even before the first patient was admitted, Mirebalais was a teaching hospital, because the skills necessary to build it, which were not available in Haiti, were transferred from Americans, Dominicans, Cubans, and some Haitian diaspora. The companies that got involved, Hewlett-Packard built the IT backbone of the hospital, not in Haiti, but probably from China mostly, and can service it from far away too. Again, this stuff has never really happened before. And so it's very uplifting, not just to finally have a good teaching hospital with a CAT scan. Did I mention the CAT scan? In Haiti, and 5 beautiful, huge operating rooms that's related to a health system. It's great to have that, but it's also great to have the partnership. And that is, to me, just as good an example of any of the power of partnership to take on serious problems like poverty and disease.
In closing, let's
I'm just getting warmed up.
Well, we can go on. But I'm wondering, and this is a really wonderful question from a high school teacher, what should young people be taught in high school before they become infatuated with the idea of success?
Yeah, that's a tough question and a great one. I hope that the school teacher will find this book a little bit useful. It takes on this topic quite directly. First of all, referring to Martin Luther King's famous speech, the drum major instinct, which you've read already, both his speech and my speech based on his speech. But I would call it something really silly sounding, but true. The quest for personal efficacy. Everybody wants to feel effective, successful. If you're a doctor, if you're an athlete or a painter, you kind of can do that, I guess, on your own, if you're a javelin thrower or something. But most people, to be successful in the endeavors that we do, have to work in teams. And they have to sometimes sublimate their own quest for personal efficacy to the desire to reach a shared goal. And that goal could be something complicated, like, I don't know, climate change. I don't know much about it, but I better learn a lot about it if I'm going to live on this planet. And same thing for global health. I think anybody can learn about it. Now, how do you get students before they're socialized for success, right? We're telling them at places, in high school too, I heard it a lot, you've got to focus on your own personal achievement. I think we could change our pedagogy a bit too. You've written about this, Claudia. To elevate a little bit more these shared social goals and projects. And we can just lift it up a little bit in our lives. Thank you.
So this new book is addressed to the young, and I have to ask you, when you look at the current generation, people who are called, for want of a better word, the millennials, people our age often complain that they're self-absorbed, self-interested, lost in their technology. I have to say, I don't see that among my students who are wonderfully idealistic and often don't have a place to put their idealism. Based on your experience, is it a fair rap or an unfair
It's an unfair rap to say that they're disconnected because they're connected. That's not true. Now, I would wish that they'd stop texting in the street and having need for orthopedic surgery after that. Yeah. And, but it's just not, it's not true. Their way of engaging, if you have a teenager like I do, you know that it's a different way of engaging, but the activism does not need to be attenuated because it is different from ours, from what we, activism it just means being active on a subject that is beyond your own quest for personal efficacy in your own field, right? And, whether it's global health equity, what I'm kind of pushing here, or working on complex problems like housing insecurity in places like New York, or how a market can be humane and decent. I think this generation is not only more connected, but more informed. Now, there's a lot of misinformation that gets circulated in these, 140 character tweets or whatever they're called. But I don't think, any more than you as a teacher, I don't believe it's fair. And I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves and these causes, if we don't see the power of engagement of this generation. Let me just give one example. At Stanford, I hate that it's Stanford, but there you have it. At Stanford, I'm kidding. I don't hate it. I mean, it is Stanford. Stanford, a group of students who, when they were 18, went to Zambia. They got involved. This is, just a few years ago. The HIV drugs were already around, and they were working on AIDS projects in Zambia, which, again, in that country, in Southern Africa, is clearly the leading killer of young adults, and probably at the top for children, along with tuberculosis, the two of them. And they lost a lot of their coworkers, the people they were working with. And they came back, and I was lucky enough that they met with me, 18 years old. And they told me what was going on, and I said, well, were the patients you were working on, the people, I call everybody a patient. I'm sorry about that. It's not a bad thing for your doctor to call you a patient. The people with whom you were working, were they receiving therapy for AIDS with antiretrovirals? And they said no. I said, well, that's the only treatment we've got for this disease. They said, what should we do? And I said, well, you should help us fight for this, for the millions of people on that continent alone, not the continent of North America or Stanford, who need this therapy. Those students started something with Facebook called Face AIDS. And within a small amount of time, in a couple of years, they'd raised over $2 million for Partners in Health to push forward this equity agenda with the tools that we need. So nobody, and there are example after example of young people using their tools for communication to move forward the kind of agenda that I'm talking about. So I'm, just like you, a believer that this is a generation who, yes, they need to understand the big picture, but so do policymakers my age. You'd think that policymakers my age would understand the big picture, but they don't understand the big picture either, any more than doctors or nurses do, or in a different way. I think this lack of ability to see the big picture is, I think everybody has it. You have to fight for it. That's what Martin Luther King did, throughout his life, but especially toward the end of it. He tried to understand global poverty and global injustice, and it's really hard to do. And I thank you, Claudia, not only for inviting me here, and I did answer your email through those modern modes of technology that we just said were okay within an hour. But I thank you for my invitation, but I thank you even more for elevating this question of poverty and global poverty in this speaker series. So thank you.
Paul, so many of us are so grateful, not just for your clarity in your writing, but more importantly, what you do in the external world. Paul will be here and meeting his friends and his supporters and signing books for you and meeting some of my students after the program. So, though it's hard to find a good close, in television they have something called the kicker, which is usually a superficial last line to end an interview, but we can't really find an appropriate kicker right here. So I'll simply say, thank you, Paul Farmer.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.